They say silence has its own sound. In Cedar Hollow, Oregon, that sound is the hush between rain and memory, the quiet pulse of a town that once mattered, now tucked beneath the sighing pines. And at the center of it all sits a cabin cafe so small you could drive right past and never know a story still lives there. It's called the Hearthlight. A hand-painted sign hangs above the door, weathered and faded, the kind of lettering done by love, not by design. Inside, the air smells faintly of cedar smoke and old coffee beans. The floors creak. The shelves hold mugs that don't match chipped but cherished. And behind the counter stands Margaret Hale, 72 years old, wearing the kind of patience that only comes from living long enough to lose what you once thought would last forever. Margaret opens the cafe at dawn, though no one comes that early anymore. She moves through the morning like a ritual. Fills the percolator, polishes the counter, arranges the sugar packets into neat little rows. Her motions are steady, quiet, almost prayerful. The bell above the door barely rings these days, but she keeps it polished anyway. Once upon a time, the Hearthlight was a gathering place. Truckers, mill workers, traveling families. They all stopped for a cup of warmth before heading back into the rain. You could hear laughter in every corner then. The walls were alive with stories. But when the mill closed 10 years ago, the town began to thin. People left one by one, chasing jobs in the cities or dreams that didn't belong to small towns anymore. Those who stayed learned to live smaller, quieter. The roads grew lonelier. And the Hearthlight, that once beating heart of Cedar Hollow, began to slow too. Margaret stayed not out of obligation, but out of love. She'd built this cafe with her husband Franklin decades ago when their hands were young and their hearts were wide open. They used to joke that the place had a heartbeat of its own. As long as there's a light in the window, Franklin would say someone will find their way home. But Franklin's gone now. And most mornings the light feels like it's shining for no one. It's late October when we first see her, fully a gray morning dripping with fog. Margaret stands by the window watching the rain streak down the glass. The cafe's open sign glows dimly, but there's no one on the road. Only the whisper of wind through the pine needles and the slow tick of an old wall clock that's been counting her days for 40 years. She wipes her hands on her apron and pours a cup of coffee, just one. She always pours two out of habit, then stops herself halfway through. The second cup used to be Franklin's. She sets it down anyway across from her at the empty table by the window. Steam curls upward, thin as memory. On the counter sits a small tin box, dented, decorated with faded blue enamel. Inside are hundreds of folded letters. Margaret writes one every night before closing. Each begins the same way. Dear Frank. Some letters are short, just a line about the weather or the way the rain sounded that day. Others are longer, more like conversations than confessions. She never reads them back. They're not meant to be answered. They're how she keeps the dialogue alive. You'd laugh if you saw the place now, she whispers to the empty air. I still wipe the tables twice, even when no one's been here. It's the kind of loneliness that isn't loud or dramatic. It's gentle, the kind that hums in the background like a refrigerator late at night. The kind many people her age know too well when the world keeps moving and you quietly stay behind, holding the space you once filled together. Margaret doesn't see herself as lonely, though. Not really. She sees herself as keeping watch. There's dignity in that, in preserving something small and good, even when no one's looking. To her, the cafe isn't just a business. It's a promise that kindness should have a place to rest, even if no one stops by to share it. Some nights she'll sit by the window with a blanket over her knees and listen to the rain. She'll whisper to Frank like he's sitting right there beside her. I still keep your mug on the shelf, she says softly. Haven't washed it since the day you left. Don't worry. The dust's just a little extra memory. And if you looked through the window just then, you might think she's talking to herself. But if you stayed a while, really watched, you'd see something more. You'd see a woman still living with love, even when love has changed its shape. That's what the Hearthlight really is, not a cafe, but a kind of soul sanctuary. A place where a cup of coffee isn't just caffeine, but communion. Small towns like Cedar Hollow still exist across America. Quiet, nearly forgotten places that hold the last traces of a slower kind of living. And inside them, people like Margaret, invisible to the speed of modern life, still open their doors each morning as if the world might come home today. There's something sacred about that kind of perseverance. It's not grand, not newsworthy, but it carries a truth we often overlook. Not all hope shouts. Some of it just waits. Some of it keeps a kettle warm. And then one stormy night, when even the trees seemed to bend in sorrow, the waiting ended. Something wild and unexpected arrived at the edge of Margaret's world. Not a customer, not a person at all. A creature of the forest, lost, trembling, and about to change everything. If you've ever sat alone in a quiet room and felt the air hum with memories, stay close. The story's just beginning, and sometimes the smallest life can awaken the biggest part of your own. Every storm brings something with it, sometimes loss, sometimes memory. And once in a long while, something you never expected to need. It was a Thursday evening in late October, the kind of night when the mountains disappear behind a veil of rain. Wind pressed against the pines, bending them till they whispered like old ghosts. The cafe was almost ready to close. Margaret had turned off the front lights, leaving only the golden glow of the wood stove. She checked the door twice, though there hadn't been a customer all day. The air smelled of smoke and cinnamon, her attempt at comfort in an empty room. She sighed, rubbed her hands together for warmth, and spoke softly toward the photograph above the register. Storms rolling in Frank. Guess it's just you and me again. Thunder rolled low and heavy, the kind that seems to shake loose the past. She reached for her shawl, ready to lock up when she heard it. At first it was faint, a sound half swallowed by rain. A cry. A groan. It came again, sharper this time, from somewhere near the porch. Margaret froze, listening. It wasn't human. It wasn't the wind, either. Something in the tone, fragile but fierce, pulled at her in a way she didn't understand. She opened the door just enough for the rain to slap her face. Lightning cracked above the ridge, lighting up the gravel path that led from the road. And there, at the foot of the steps, huddled against the wall, was a small creature, thin-soaked, shivering so hard the movement barely looked alive. It was a bobcat kitten, maybe 6 months old, maybe less. Its fur, once a burnished gold, was matted and darkened by mud. One paw twisted slightly beneath it as if injured. Its sides heaved with each breath. For a long moment, Margaret simply stood there, unsure what to do. Wild animals didn't come this close to people, not here, not ever. Yet there it was, trembling under the awning, eyes flickering open at the sound of her voice. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered. "What happened to you?" Instinct told her to stay back. But another instinct, older and deeper, said otherwise. Maybe it was the echo of motherhood that never fully leaves a woman's heart, or maybe it was loneliness, recognizing its own shape. Either way, she stepped forward. The rain was cold, but the creature was colder. When she reached down, it didn't move, just let her hands scoop it up, limp but breathing. She carried it inside like something sacred. She placed it near the stove on a folded towel, close enough to feel the warmth but far enough to breathe. The tiny chest rose and fell in an unsteady rhythm. She fetched another towel, gently drying its fur, speaking softly as she worked. "You're safe now. No one's gonna hurt you here." She poured a small bowl of water, then warmed some milk. The kitten didn't drink, not yet, but its ears twitched at her voice. In that quiet moment, the rain still drumming outside, thunder fading into the distance, the cafe felt alive again. The firelight flickered across the walls, and for the first time in months, Margaret felt she wasn't entirely alone. There's a kind of grace that arrives only when you're no longer expecting it. Some might call it a coincidence, others divine timing. But Margaret knew what it felt like, an answer to a prayer she hadn't spoken out loud. All her life, she'd believed in small mercies, the way life sends us reminders when we begin to forget ourselves. She didn't see this bobcat as a sign, not exactly, but as a moment of mercy, a flicker of wildness that had chosen her doorstep. She sat beside it until midnight, watching the shadows shift across its body. Its fur began to dry, its breathing steadied. Now and then it let out a small sound, not a meow, not quite a growl, something between. It felt like life itself trying to find its way back. She whispered a name, half to test it, half to make it real. "Rowan." she said quietly. "You look like a rowan tree. Tough little thing." The name seemed to fit, not fancy, not sentimental, just right. The world is full of noise now. Most people would have called animal control, turned away, or taken a picture for social media and moved on. But Margaret didn't think like that. She belonged to an older rhythm, one that still believed in responsibility for what crosses your path. She thought of Franklin and how he used to say, "Every living thing that finds you for a reason." Maybe the reason didn't matter. Maybe all that mattered was showing up, the simple act of caring without asking what you'll get back. That night she realized kindness isn't always grand. Sometimes it's just holding out your hands in a storm. By morning, the rain had stopped. The mountains stood clear again, their peaks frosted with new snow. Margaret woke in the armchair beside the stove, the towel still draped across her lap. Rowan was sitting up now, blinking in the soft light. His fur, dry and fluffed, revealed faint rosettes and streaks of gold. His eyes were pale green, wild, unblinking, but not afraid. When she reached out, he didn't flinch. He let her touch his head just once before lowering it back onto his paws. That small acceptance, the trust of something wild, felt like a miracle. She smiled, tears welling without warning. It had been years since she'd woken to another heartbeat in the room. "Well," she said softly, "looks like we both made it through the storm." Later, as she swept the floor and refilled the coffee pot, she found herself humming. She couldn't remember the last time she'd done that. The café looked different now, not fuller, but somehow more alive. The wind through the chimney no longer sounded like emptiness. It sounded like breathing. That evening, she wrote another letter to Franklin. "A small thing happened tonight. Lost and half drowned, he came to the door. I think he's staying a while. Maybe I needed someone to remind me that there's still life in this place and in me." She folded the paper and slipped it into the tin box. Outside, the last of the rain dripped from the pine needles, each drop catching the light like a spark. In every town like Cedar Hollow, there's a quiet line between the human world and the wild one. Most of us never notice it, too busy, too sheltered. But for those who've lost something, that line grows thinner. Maybe that's why Rowan found her. Maybe the lost find each other, creature and human, drawn by the same invisible ache. In the end, it didn't matter how he came to be there. What mattered was that he had come. By the third morning, Rowan was walking. By the end of the week, he was exploring every corner of the café, his paw prints leaving soft dust on the old wooden floor. And soon, someone driving through Cedar Hollow would spot a flash of gold in the café window, a wild bobcat sitting beside a woman, both looking out at the rain. That single image would spread farther than either of them could imagine. But for now, it was still just them, two survivors, sharing the same roof, the same quiet, the same slow return to life. If you've ever taken in something fragile, a stray, a friend, a memory, and found that it healed you in return, stay close. The story of the hearthlight is about to bloom. And sometimes all it takes to begin again is opening the door when the storm knocks. Sometimes life begins again so quietly you almost miss it. A breath, a flicker, a small sound that reminds you the world hasn't forgotten you yet. 3 weeks had passed since the storm, the night Rowan arrived at the hearthlight. The forest had already slipped into the deeper colors of autumn. Gold leaves gathered along the porch steps, and each morning the air smelled faintly of pine needles and smoke. Margaret's days found a new rhythm. She'd open the café before dawn, as always, but now there was movement, the soft pad of paws across the floorboards, the flicker of curious eyes under the chairs. Rowan had healed enough to explore, though he still limped slightly on his left paw. He moved with the kind of grace that reminded Margaret of something sacred strength wrapped in fragility. The café, once silent as a church at midnight, now had sound again, small living sound. The scrape of claws on wood, the soft thump of paws landing on the counter. The low rumbling purr filled the space between raindrops and clock ticks. Margaret began speaking more too, not to fill the silence, but to share it. "Morning, partner," she'd say, setting out a saucer of water near the stove. "Looks like another day for the brave." And if you were standing there, you might swear that Rowan, the wild bobcat, tilted his head just enough to listen. It started small, as all miracles do. One morning, the mail carrier, Mr. Jensen, stopped by. He'd been delivering letters in Cedar Hollow for 40 years, though there weren't many left to deliver now. Through the window, he saw something that made him park his truck and step inside for the first time in months. The sight stopped him: the woman, the cat, the firelight. The wild and the domestic share one quiet room. "Well, I'll be," he said softly. "Didn't know you were running a wildlife cafe now, Margaret." She laughed. Truly laughed, the kind that shakes the dust off old sorrow. "He found me," she replied. "Guess he needed a warm cup as much as the rest of us." Jensen sat down for coffee. He stayed longer than he meant to. Before leaving, he asked if he could take a photo. Just one. "For my wife," he said. "She won't believe this." 2 days later, that photo. The one of a weathered cafe window with a golden bobcat staring out beside a steaming cup appeared on the local bulletin board at the post office. By the weekend, 3 travelers from the neighboring town drove up to see if it was real. Margaret baked a pie for the occasion, apple cinnamon, Franklin's old recipe. She served coffee, told the story of how Rowan came in from the storm. The guests smiled, touched his paw print on the counter, and stayed to talk longer than they planned. When they left, the bell above the door jingled once, then again, then again. The sound filled the room like music. It's strange how a single heartbeat, even a wild one, can change the air around it. The hearthlight seemed to breathe again. The wood stove burned brighter. The smell of coffee lingered longer, sweeter. Every corner felt softer, as if the building itself had been waiting for this, for life to return. Margaret began to understand what Franklin had meant all those years ago. As long as there's a light in the window, someone will find their way home. She realized now that the light wasn't just for others, it was for her. For her tired hands, her quiet mornings, her unspoken prayers. It was for the part of her that still believed kindness had power. In the still moments between customers, she'd watch Rowan sleep by the stove, his chest rising and falling with perfect calm. And she'd whisper not to him, but to something larger. Maybe we're both being kept in our own way. The story of the bobcat and the cafe began to move through the town like a slow, gentle wave. People who hadn't spoken in years stopped each other at the market to ask, "Have you seen the cat yet?" The postmaster dropped by one morning with his grandson. A retired teacher brought a sketch pad and drew Rowan sleeping by the window. What surprised Margaret most wasn't the attention, it was the tenderness that came with it. Everyone seemed softer here. People lingered, laughed, easily shared stories of their own. A widow named Helen came one day with a tin of lemon cookies. "He reminds me of my old cat Charlie," she said, her eyes bright. "After my husband passed, that cat was the only reason I got out of bed for months." Margaret understood without needing to say so. Loss has a way of teaching you fluency in silence, how to hear what's not being said. She simply nodded and poured Helen a second cup. That afternoon, when Helen left, she paused at the door and whispered, "Thank you for keeping the light on." Within a few weeks, the hearth light was no longer empty. It wasn't crowded either, just alive. Farmers, retirees, travelers, and even a pair of hikers passing through stopped to rest. And each one left with a story. Rowan the bobcat had a way of sensing who needed him most. When someone sat alone, he'd approach quietly, resting his paw on their knee before curling beside them. More than once, Margaret saw a tear slip down a stranger's cheek as they stroked his fur. It wasn't magic. It was empathy, the oldest kind shared between living beings. "He just knows," people began to say. "He knows when you're hurting." That phrase spread like a soft secret. Soon, even those who had never believed in small miracles found themselves driving out to Cedar Hollow just to see the wild cat who stayed. Margaret started writing shorter letters to Franklin, now not from sadness, but from peace. The bell rings again. "Love," one read. "Not often, but enough. I think you'd like what's happening here. The place feels alive, and somehow, so do I." She tucked the letter into the tin box and looked around the cafe. The morning light fell through the window, catching dust motes that danced like tiny golden spirits. Rowan lifted his head and blinked slowly, content. In that stillness, Margaret felt it clearly: the cafe was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who needed a bit of warmth in a cold world. There's a truth hidden in stories like this one that people in small towns know by heart. Community doesn't disappear. It just sleeps waiting for someone to wake it. Sometimes it takes a storm, a stray, or a stubborn woman who refuses to lock the door. The hearthlight had become more than a place to drink coffee. It was a reminder that love once planted never truly dies. It only waits for light, but where there's light, there's also shadow. Word of the hearthlight's revival spread farther than Margaret expected, and soon attention came from beyond Cedar Hollow, not the kind wrapped in kindness but in commerce. What began as a story of small grace was about to be tested by something much larger. If you've ever seen something once lonely come back to life, a garden, a friendship, a forgotten dream, you know this feeling. Stay with this story, because sometimes when the world tries to move too fast, it's the quiet places that remind us what really matters. Sometimes when one small light flickers back to life, others see it and begin to find their way through the dark too. By late November, the hearthlight was no longer the loneliest spot in Cedar Hollow. The little café had become a kind of secret the town shared not loudly but lovingly. A quiet buzz traveled from porch to porch, whispered over fence lines, through the aisles of the market. You heard about that bobcat, the one at Margaret's place. It wasn't just curiosity that brought people up the winding road. It was something deeper, a longing that most hadn't realized they carried. The town had grown too still, too disconnected. Many had slipped into their own silences after years of lost retirement or change. They missed the way life used to feel, and somehow a wild creature sitting beside an old woman's stove reminded them of that. So they started coming. 1 or 2 at first, then more. Not for the coffee, though. Margaret still made the best in the county. They came for warmth that couldn't be poured into a cup. On a Tuesday morning, Mr. Henderson, who used to run the old lumber yard, shuffled through the door. His cane tapped the floor like punctuation. Margaret hadn't seen him since Franklin's funeral. He looked around the cafe, smiled faintly and said, "Smells just like it used to. Coffee and firewood. That's the scent of home, you know." He took his usual seat, the one by the window, and waited quietly. It wasn't long before Rowan appeared, stretching his tail, flicking lazily as he crossed the floor. The bobcat stopped beside Henderson's boot, tilted his head, and pressed his paw gently against the man's leg. The room went still. The old man chuckled softly, his eyes glistening. "Guess I've been chosen," he said. "Haven't had that happen in a while." He came back every day after that. Sometimes he'd bring a newspaper. Sometimes just stories, the kind you can only tell when you think nobody remembers you. Margaret listened, nodding, letting the rhythm of his voice fill the empty corners. Then there was Mrs. Doyle, who used to bake lemon pies for every church fundraiser in town. She'd lost her husband 2 winters ago and hadn't left her house much since. When she walked in, Margaret greeted her with such warmth it nearly startled her. "Been too long, Helen?" Margaret said, pouring her tea. "I kept your mug right where you left it." Mrs. Doyle blinked, her voice trembling. "I didn't think anyone would remember that." That day she brought a pie. The next week she brought 3, just in case anyone else stops by, and soon someone did. There's something sacred about seeing the old come back together, not for nostalgia, but for belonging. They didn't talk about the hard years. They didn't dwell on the mill closing or the losses that had aged them faster than time should allow. They simply shared space. Shared silence, shared small joys that had grown rare. A laugh that echoed the smell of cinnamon, the sight of Rowan hopping onto the counter like he owned the place. One could almost feel the cafe inhale again, as if each story, each smile was oxygen returning to a tired heart. Margaret often stood behind the counter, watching it unfold. "They're not customers," she wrote in one of her letters to Franklin. "They're echoes finding their way home." In every small town, there's a generation that quietly slips out of view. The ones who built the roads, taught the children, raised the families, and then somehow were left standing in the empty spaces they helped create. They don't seek attention, they seek connection. Not pity, but presence. A chair pulled out for them, a voice saying, "We're glad you came." At the hearthlight, they found that again. It wasn't about nostalgia, it was about being seen. Margaret never advertised, never changed her sign, never added fancy drinks or bright lights. She just kept the stove burning and the bell polished. That was enough. The café became a small sanctuary for the forgotten ones, a reminder that time might age you, but kindness still recognizes you. And somehow, Rowan knew it too. He was still wild at heart, but there was a gentleness in the way he moved among people. When someone came in heavy with unspoken grief, he seemed to notice. He'd circle once, approach quietly, and rest his head against their knee. No tricks, no training, just presence. People started saying he had a gift, a healing kind of intuition. Margaret didn't argue. She just smiled, watching how his simple stillness spoke louder than any words she could offer. One afternoon, a young woman came in, maybe 30, maybe younger, with eyes that had clearly run out of tears. She said she'd lost her father that month. "Someone told me about the cat," she whispered. "Said he helps." She sat near the fire, hands folded tight. Rowan approached her, slow and unafraid. He climbed onto the seat beside her, pressed his body close, and began to purr low, deep, rhythmic. The sound filled the room. She closed her eyes. The cafe fell quiet except for the steady hum of comfort. When she left, she turned to Margaret and said softly, "I didn't think I'd feel peace again. Not today. Thank you for keeping this place." Margaret watched her drive away, the gravel crunching beneath her tires. Then she turned back to the cat and said, "You're doing holy work, little one. You just don't know it." That night, Margaret stayed up late cleaning the tables. She moved more slowly now, not from age, but from reverence. Every smudge of a mug, every paw print felt like proof that the world could still gather itself around something good. She thought about how life had quietly led her here, not to be alone, but to be a keeper of light. Maybe that's all any of us are meant to do, she thought. Hold the warmth long enough for someone else to feel it. For people like Margaret, and so many in towns like hers, being needed isn't about work anymore. It's about purpose, the kind that can't be bought or planned, only found. And when that purpose comes, it doesn't arrive with fanfare. It comes on soft pause in the eyes of a stranger, in the laughter that returns after years of silence. Cedar Hollow began to look different that winter. Porch lights stayed on longer. Neighbors stopped by one another's doors. Someone fixed the broken bench outside the post office. The town was still small, still quiet, but alive. All because an old cafe kept its door open and a wild bobcat decided to stay. But as the fire of life returned, another kind of heat began to rise, one not born of community but of commerce. News of the hearthlight spread beyond the town's borders. And soon Margaret would find that keeping something pure, alive in a modern world, comes with its own kind of storm. If you've ever walked back into a place you thought was gone, a memory, a friendship, a quiet part of yourself, you know how powerful it feels to be remembered. Stay with this story. The next part will show what happens when love is tested by the noise of the world, and how even small kindness can hold its ground. Every light, no matter how warm, casts a shadow. And sometimes the brighter the glow, the more the darkness notices. By early winter, the hearthlight had become the heart of Cedar Hollow again. On weekends, the bell above the door never seemed to stop ringing. Locals lingered over coffee. Travelers came from nearby towns, drawn by the story of the wild bobcat who healed hearts. Margaret didn't seek fame, it found her quietly, like a ripple spreading wider than anyone meant. A journalist passing through snapped a few photos for a regional magazine. The headline was simple, "A bobcat, a widow, and the cafe that brought a town back to life." It was meant to be a feel-good story, and it was. But attention has a way of opening doors you'd rather keep closed. Within weeks, the article reached farther than Cedar Hollow. People came from the city. Social media posts appeared with pictures of Rowan the miracle bobcat. Some called him magical. Others called him a tourist attraction. And one morning a letter arrived, printed official, sealed with a logo Margaret had never seen before. The letter came from a large coffee franchise, Maple and Brew Co., a chain with stores from Seattle to Portland. They'd taken note of her inspiring story and wanted to bring the Hearthlight brand into the modern era. They offered to buy the property, keep her name in spirit, and build what they called a legacy location, a community-forward experience. The offer was generous, more money than Margaret had ever imagined seeing. Enough to retire comfortably, to finally rest. But it came with one unspoken truth once she sold the hearthlight, as she knew it would be gone. She read the letter 3 times, then set it beside the kettle. The next morning, she found a second envelope, this one from her landlord. It was a notice. Rent would be increasing to reflect new commercial interest. She didn't finish her coffee that day. Margaret had spent months rebuilding this little world of warmth and kindness, not realizing that success could come with a price. The same attention that had filled her café was now threatening to take it away. She sat alone by the window that night, the fire casting long shadows across the floor. Rowan was curled nearby, asleep but restless, twitching in his dreams. "I think we flew too close to the light, Frank," she whispered. Maybe this is what happens when something good gets seen by the wrong eyes. Her heart ached, not from fear of losing money, but from the thought of losing meaning. The cafe wasn't just her livelihood, it was her lifeline. Every mug she washed, every story she listened to, every quiet moment beside the bobcat by the fire, it all carried her husband's voice, her town's memory, her sense of purpose. And now, for the first time in years, she felt that purpose slipping. In the weeks that followed, Margaret tried to ignore the growing tension. Business stayed steady, but so did the letters. Each one more urgent, more polished, more persuasive. The franchise promised upgrades, national recognition, and sustainability partnerships. She didn't sleep well. Her chest ached at night. One afternoon, while refilling the coffee urn, she felt dizzy and had to sit down. Her friend Mrs. Doyle found her pale and trembling. The next thing Margaret remembered was waking in the hospital, a nurse by her side. "You've been running too hard," the doctor said gently. "Exhaustion, mild arrhythmia. You need rest." Rest, the one thing she couldn't afford. When word spread through Cedar Hollow, something unexpected happened. The same people she'd cared for began to care for her. Mr. Henderson took over opening the cafe each morning. Mrs. Doyle handled baking. The younger locals volunteered to serve. Even Rowan, sensing her absence, spent most of his days lying near the door, waiting. The town that had once forgotten itself now remembered how to stand together. Margaret had always been the giver. The one who poured the coffee, listened, and comforted. It had never occurred to her that one day she might need to be on the receiving end. When Sarah Collins, the nurse who treated her, stopped by after her shift with a thermos of tea, Margaret smiled faintly. "You've done enough," she said. "Let us just for once," Sarah replied. "You've carried this place long enough. Let it carry you now." There was something deeply humbling about that moment, to realize that love, once shared freely, always finds its way back. The letters from Maple and Brew didn't stop. The tone changed from kind to cold, from offers to warnings. They mentioned zoning rights, development permits, and the inevitability of progress. Margaret saw the world's pattern in it, the slow replacement of small wonders by louder, shinier things. In the same way machines replaced hands or digital replaced handwritten. "They'll build a cafe with better coffee," she told Mrs. Doyle one evening, "but they'll never build another heartbeat like this one." The words lingered, and maybe that's why when the town gathered to discuss the franchise proposal, people didn't talk about profit. They talked about peace, about belonging, about what they'd lose if they let someone else define their story. One by one, voices rose in defense of what the hearthlight had given them: connection, shelter, a reason to remember they mattered. Even the mayor, who rarely took sides, finally said, "If there's one thing this town's learned, it's that not everything worth saving fits on a spreadsheet." The following week, Maple and Brew sent representatives to negotiate. Suits, smiles, polished words. They promised jobs, tax revenue, a brighter future. Margaret, still recovering, watched from her chair by the fire as her neighbors filled every seat in the cafe. They spoke calmly, firmly, one after another. Helen Doyle read a statement about local heritage. Mr. Henderson reminded them that not every improvement is an upgrade. And young Sarah, her voice steady, said simply, "You can't buy what this place gives us. You can't franchise kindness." Rowan lay beside the stove-tail, flicking slowly. The room held a stillness that felt almost holy. By the time the representatives left, their smiles had faded. No one in Cedar Hollow wanted what they were selling. That night, Margaret returned home exhausted but at peace. She poured a cup of tea, sat beside Rowan, and stared into the fire. "We didn't win anything big," she murmured, "but we kept what was ours. That's enough." She thought about how hard it had been, the sleepless nights, the fear of losing everything. But she also thought about how in the process the town had found something far greater than money could buy each other. The café had become a symbol not of commerce but of care. There's a kind of victory that doesn't make headlines. It doesn't shout or celebrate. It just sits quietly breathing, knowing it's done the right thing. That's what the Hearthlight became that winter, a steady pulse in a world that moved too fast. It stood for every small place that refuses to let kindness be replaced by convenience. But even after the company backed away, life didn't return to simple peace. Margaret's health was still fragile, and time, as always, was moving forward. The café would have to learn to survive without her constant hands, and soon the Hearthlight would become something even larger than its walls. If you've ever fought to keep something gentle alive in a world that prizes speed and profit, you'll understand what comes next. Stay with this story. Because the real test of love isn't how loudly it stands, but how quietly it endures. Some stories are written on paper. Others drift between hearts, passed quietly from one pair of hands to another, carried like letters in the wind. Margaret returned home from the hospital slower, gentler. The doctor's words still echoed. "You need to rest." But rest felt like something she didn't quite know how to do. The Hearthlight had been her heartbeat for so long that stepping away felt like forgetting to breathe. Still, the café continued without her, and somehow, that was its own miracle. While she healed upstairs in her small apartment above the café, life below went on. Mornings filled with the smell of cinnamon, afternoons with laughter. The bell above the door rang not for money, but for community. And at the center of it all were the same faces that had once come to be comforted, now returning the favor. Mrs. Doyle baked pies. Mr. Henderson managed the till, though his eyesight wasn't what it used to be. Sarah Collins, the young nurse, organized shifts and volunteers. The Hearthlight was no longer one woman's dream. It was everyone's. One evening, while sweeping behind the counter, Sarah noticed something strange. The light from the stove had caught a shimmer behind a stack of old tin boxes. She pulled one out. It was worn smooth from years of handling the paint, chipped, the edges dented. When she lifted the lid, she froze. Inside were dozens of folded letters, each one marked with the same words in careful handwriting. "Dear Frank." The oldest dated back decades, the newest just last week. She read one at random. "The mornings are quiet now, love. Sometimes I talk to you out loud just to hear what hope sounds like again." Sarah closed the letter, her throat tightening. She sat in the empty café for a long time, the hum of the refrigerator and the distant wind the only sounds. By the next morning, she'd told Mrs. Doyle and Mr. Henderson. They decided to show Margaret what they'd found. At first, Margaret blushed when they mentioned the letters. "Oh, those are nothing," she said, trying to wave it off. But the truth was, they were everything. "They were my way of talking to him," she confessed. "When the world got too quiet, I'd write. It made me feel like someone was still listening." Mrs. Doyle reached across the table, her voice trembling. "Then maybe we should let the world listen too." They began to read one letter aloud each morning before opening. Nothing grand, just a few lines, a glimpse into love written through the years. Some were about the weather, some about small triumphs like getting the espresso machine to work again. Some about sorrow too deep to name. People started leaving notes of their own on the counter, little scraps of paper folded into mugs or tucked under saucers. "Dear Mom, I miss your pie." "Dear Joe, I'm doing better now." "Dear me, keep trying." The Hearthlight had become a kind of living letter. Every visit, every shared glance, another line in a growing conversation about love loss and endurance. There's a quiet beauty in watching care pass from one generation to the next, like watching light travel across the room as the sun moves. Sarah had started this whole effort simply to help. But as she read Margaret's words, something changed in her too. She began to see what this cafe really meant. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't business. It was living proof that gentleness could outlast time itself. The younger volunteers started calling it the House of Letters. Local teachers brought their students to drop off thank you notes or prayers. A group of retired woodworkers built a small letterbox by the door that read, "Write what your heart remembers." By Christmas, it was full. On the first day of snow, Margaret came downstairs for the first time in weeks. The crowd fell silent when she entered, not out of pity but respect. Sarah led her to a corner table. Beside her seat sat the tin box, polished and placed in the center of the room. The townspeople had hung her letters along a clothesline that stretched across the beam's paper, swaying gently in the warm air. Each letter moved slightly with every breath of wind that came through the cracks in the window. It looked like the room itself was exhaling stories. Margaret's eyes filled. She pressed her hand against her chest and whispered, "You've turned my memories into light." She sat there for hours, reading quietly, as Rowan lay at her feet, his tail curled around her shoes. People came and went, ordering coffee, writing new notes, leaving flowers on the counter. Nobody hurried. Nobody raised their voice. The cafe was still and yet full of life. When Margaret looked around that afternoon, she didn't see a business or even a building anymore. She saw something that had grown beyond her. "Frank would laugh," she said to Sarah. "He used to say the world moves too fast. But look at this. They're slowing down just long enough to care." The hearth light had become a reflection of her life, imperfect, weathered, but full of soul. Every person who stepped inside carried a piece of it home. And for the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel afraid of slowing down. She could finally rest knowing that what she'd built was strong enough to stand without her constant hands. We live in a world that forgets easily, faces kindnesses, even the sound of our own patience. But stories like this one remind us that memory is not about holding on, it's about passing forward. Each letter Margaret wrote was an act of hope. Each one someone else wrote in response was an act of belonging. Together, they formed a quiet rebellion against loneliness. The letters weren't grand declaration. They were proof that love, in its simplest, most human form, is what keeps a place alive. Winter deepened, and the cafe glowed like an ember in the snow. Rowan grew slower, sleeping more often by the fire. Margaret watched him with quiet understanding. Seasons were shifting again in the forest, in the town, and in her own heart. Soon, change would come once more. Not as loss this time, but as something gentle, the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. If you've ever kept letters, you couldn't throw away a note, a recipe, a name written in familiar handwriting you already understand. Words like love never really vanish. They just wait for a little wind to carry them home. Stay close. The story's next breath will remind us why every ending is just another way to begin. Not every goodbye comes with sorrow. Some arrive like winter, turning to spring, quiet, inevitable, and filled with grace. Winter settled gently over Cedar Hollow that year. Snow blanketed the pines, softening every sound, every footstep. The cafe windows glowed with amber light, fogged by warmth and breath and laughter. Inside, the hearth light felt like the heart of the valley, steady, beating alive. But for Margaret, time had begun to slow differently. Her body tired sooner, her hands trembled a little more each morning. The doctor called it natural aging. She called it the price of having loved long. Still, she came downstairs every day, wrapped in her old wool shawl, ready to pour the first cup, to listen, to smile. And always by the stove lay Rowan, older now too, though his spirit remained the same. His fur had dulled to a softer gold, and he no longer leapt onto the counter as he once did. But his eyes, that wild green, still carried something beyond words. Wisdom, patience, love. One cold February morning, the cafe was unusually still. The regulars had stayed home to wait out a snowstorm. Margaret didn't mind the quiet. She liked how snow made the world honest, simple, and hushed. She brewed a small pot of coffee, humming an old tune Franklin used to love. The smell filled the room, rich and grounding. When she turned toward the fire, she saw Rowan watching her, not moving, just watching. "You're still with me, aren't you?" she whispered. He blinked slowly, his breathing shallow but peaceful. Margaret sat beside him, one hand resting on his back. The fire popped softly. For a long time there was nothing to say, only the rhythm of two beings who had carried each other through the quietest of years. That night, Rowan curled beside her chair. The snow outside had stopped. The moon hung low silver against the pines. When morning came, the fire had burned low and the room was wrapped in a stillness that felt almost holy. Rowan's eyes were half open, his body still, his spirit finally free. Margaret knelt beside him, her fingers tracing the familiar curve of his ear. Tears came but softly, not of despair but of gratitude. "Thank you, my wild heart," she murmured. "You stayed just as long as I needed you. Grief has many faces. Sometimes it roars, sometimes it simply sighs." Margaret didn't weep loudly. She tended to the moment with the same care she'd given every cup of coffee, every letter, every act of love in her long life. She wrapped Rowan gently in her shawl and placed him beside the window where he loved to watch the rain. When the townspeople learned, they came quietly, each in their own time. They brought flowers, letters, and drawings. Mr. Henderson built a small wooden box from cedar. Sarah painted a single paw print on top. Mrs. Doyle baked a pie and left a note for the friend who reminded us how to be kind. They buried Rowan beneath the largest pine behind the café where sunlight always seemed to linger longest. The earth was cold, but the air was calm. Margaret said a few words, simple, heartfelt. He came from the wild, but he chose to stay. That's the greatest act of love there is, staying. The wind rose softly through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and snow as if nature itself was listening. Wild things don't belong to us. They belong to the earth, to time, to their own unnappy truth. And yet, when one crosses our path, it changes us. Rowan had never been a pet. He'd been a companion, a teacher in his way. He reminded everyone that love doesn't have to be tamed to be real. It just has to be given freely. In a world that often measures worth in control, his presence was a quiet rebellion, a living proof that the gentlest bonds are those not held too tightly. When spring finally came, the snow melted into the soil around Rowan's resting place. From that ground, a small sapling appeared, thin green, determined. Margaret noticed it one morning while sweeping the porch. "Look at that," she whispered, smiling. "You left us something." She placed a flat stone nearby, carved with a single word, Rowan. The cafe's visitors began leaving small offerings there, pine cones, notes, a smooth rock from the creek. Children traced their names in the dirt. Some swore they'd seen a flicker of gold among the trees at dusk, a flash of fur, a glimmering presence. Whether they truly did or not didn't matter. What mattered was what they felt, that some part of him was still here. That spring, the hearthlight bloomed again in a new way. The windows stayed open longer. The laughter grew lighter. Birds built nests in the eaves, and Margaret often said he'd like this all this life. She no longer wrote letters to Franklin. She spoke to him instead, softly between moments, her words blending with the wind through the pines. There's a kind of wisdom that comes only with age. The understanding that endings aren't really endings, just seasons shifting inside the heart. Margaret began to see her own life like that, winter and spring loss and renewal all woven together. She still had quite aches, yes, but they didn't feel empty anymore. They felt full of memory, of meaning, of the life she'd shared with both the man she'd loved and the creature who'd reminded her how to love again. Maybe she thought we all need a bit of wildness to wake us up. Something to remind us that the world is still alive even when we forget to look. Rowan's story became part of Cedar Hollow's rhythm, told and retold in gentle voices. People came not just for coffee anymore, but to sit by the window where he once slept, to watch the seasons change the way he once did. And in each of them, in the way they spoke softer, lingered longer, or noticed the color of the sunset more, a little bit of his wild heart lived on. That's what the best lives do. They leave behind not just memories, but ways of seeing. By summer, the hearthlight was in full bloom again. The sapling outside had grown stronger, its leaves a deeper green. The town, once defined by loss, now carried a quiet joy, and Margaret, her hair silver as frost, began to think about what came next, about legacy and the light she'd leave burning for those who would carry it forward. Because even the most steadfast fires must one day pass the flame. If you've ever loved something wild, a person, a place, a creature, you know it never really leaves you. It lingers in the way you move through the world, gentler now, more awake. Stay with this story. The final chapter is not about endings, but about what remains the warmth we leave glowing in others when our own light begins to fade. Some stories don't end when the last page turns. They keep living in the places we've touched, in the hands that carry on, and in the light that never goes out. By the time the next summer arrived, the hearthlight had settled into a new rhythm, calm, steady, full of quiet joy. The café that once felt like a lifeline had become the community's heartbeat. People came not just for the coffee, but for what the place meant. A reminder that kindness, even in small doses, could rebuild what time had worn thin. Margaret no longer opened the café at dawn. She'd pass her mornings upstairs, the window open to the sound of birds, the scent of pine drifting in. From her chair, she could see the sapling outside the one that had grown from the ground where Rowan rested. It was taller now, its branches stretching toward the sky. Sometimes when the wind moved through the leaves, she swore she could hear that familiar rustling, the sound of a wild heart at peace. Downstairs, Sarah and the others had taken over most of the work. They moved with a care that felt almost reverent, not changing what Margaret built, only tending it like a garden. The chalkboard still read coffee. Stories. Hope. The letters in the tin box still hung on the walls. New ones appeared every week, written by strangers who'd driven miles just to sit where the bobcat once slept. And though Margaret's hands trembled too much now to pour coffee, her presence lingered everywhere in the scent of vanilla. In the light that pooled across the counter, in the quiet hum of belonging that filled the room. That August, the town held its first festival of light. Sarah's idea. It's not just for Rowan, she said. It's for everything he started. As dusk fell, the people of Cedar Hollow gathered outside the cafe. Lanterns lined the road, glowing soft and gold. Children carried candles in jars. Older folks sat on benches, their faces lit by the flicker. Margaret sat near the window watching. When the music started, a slow tune played on a fiddle by the mayor's grandson. She smiled, tears glinting like the lanterns outside. Sarah stepped forward to speak. Her voice was calm. Sure. We started this night to honor a wild creature, she said. But what we really honor is what he brought back: compassion, connection, and the courage to care again. The hearthlight is proof that small things still matter. That love, when tended gently, can outlast everything else. The crowd grew still. The light shimmered across their faces, and for a moment it felt like the entire town was breathing in rhythm. One long exhale of gratitude. At the end of the night, they released paper lanterns into the sky, dozens of them rising through the dark. Each one carried a handwritten wish, some for lost loved ones, some for the living, some simply for peace. Margaret watched until they disappeared, her hand pressed against her heart. "Frank," she whispered, "I think he'd like this." "You would too." A few weeks later, when the air turned cool again, Margaret called Sarah upstairs. She sat by the window, her hair silver in the afternoon light. "It's time," she said softly. "The cafe's yours now." Sarah tried to protest, but Margaret just smiled, that same gentle, knowing smile she'd given to countless people before her. "It was never really mine," she said. "I just kept the light burning until someone else came along to tend it." That evening, after the cafe closed, Sarah and the team gathered around the counter. They lit one candle and set it beside the tin box of letters. No speeches, no applause, just a shared silence, the kind that carries weight without words. Outside, the rowan tree swayed in the wind, its leaves whispering against the glass. The moonlight caught the bark, turning it gold. Months later, when the first frost came, Margaret passed quietly in her sleep. The town held a small memorial inside the hearthlight. No black clothes, no sorrowful music. Just warmth, the smell of cinnamon coffee, the hum of familiar laughter, and a space left open by the window where she used to sit. Sarah read aloud one of Margaret's final letters, found folded in her apron pocket. "If you're reading this, don't grieve. Just promise me something, keep the light on. Keep it simple. Keep it kind. That's how we stay alive even after we're gone. Outside, snow began to fall, slow, graceful, forgiving. Years later, people still come to the hearthlight. The tree outside is taller now, strong and full. The cafe walls hold more letters than ever, stories of love loss, healing. Some from strangers who'd never met Margaret, but somehow knew her all the same. There's still a bowl of milk on the counter, always full. No one dares move it. They say it's for Rowan in case he decides to wander back through the pines. And every evening when Sarah locks the door, the last thing she does is switch on the lamp in the window. The same lamp Margaret once lit for travelers, long gone. Its glow spills out onto the road, gentle and unwavering. If you drive through Cedar Hollow after dark, you can still see it from miles away, that single golden light among the trees refusing to go out. The world moves fast now. Screens flash, clocks spin, and sometimes we forget that meaning still lives in the quiet. But here in a small town tucked between forests and sky, one cafe proves otherwise. What Margaret and Rowan built wasn't just a story of survival. It was a reminder that even in a world of noise, kindness still travels farther than we think. One act of care, one moment of love can ripple outward for years, even after we've turned to memory. The hearthlight didn't save the world. It simply reminded a few hearts how to see again. And maybe that's how the world gets saved, one illuminated soul at a time. There's something deeply human about leaving a bit of yourself behind, not in wealth, not in fame, but in warmth. A gesture, a lesson, a story that whispers, "You mattered." Margaret's cafe. Rowan's wild heart, the people who gathered, all of it continues. Each person who walks through those doors leaves with a softer gaze, a slower pace, a gentler tone. That's how legacies work. They don't end, they echo. And for everyone who sits at that old counter, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, they feel it, that invisible thread of love, connecting them to the ones who came before. Because the real miracle of the hearthlight was never the cat or the cafe. It was the courage to stay open to love, to loss, to each other. So tonight, as you finish this story, maybe take a moment to look around your own life. Ask yourself, where is my hearthlight? What small kindness can I tend to even when no one's watching? If this story touched you, let it linger. Leave a comment below and share what light you're keeping alive. And if you'd like to walk beside us as we tell more stories that rescue, heal, to protect wild hearts like the bobcat that changed everything, you can support our work by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, or sending a super thanks to help real wildlife rescue centers care for animals like Rowan. Because every gesture of compassion, no matter how small, keeps the light alive. And that light, your light, might be the one that helps someone find their way home.